Hi there, my name is Zhenya. I'm a PhD student, author, and I'm also a survivor of severe childhood trauma. And today I want to talk about why talking about trauma isn't enough to heal it, my journey with healing my trauma, at first talking about my trauma a lot, then healing my trauma, and why that is the case, that simply talking about trauma isn't enough to heal it. And then I want to explain how you can actually heal trauma, which is by healing your nervous system. Um, so let me start with my story, because I understand that there can be some resistance to this idea that talking about trauma isn't enough to heal it, because after all, that's kind of what you're told to do, right? When you're traumatized, at least that was my impression. When I wanted to heal my childhood trauma, my impression was that I should go to talk therapy, and that if I simply talked about what had happened to me, then that would resolve it. And talking about the trauma, you know, like as of itself, isn't bad. Actually, it can be quite empowering to talk about your trauma, especially if, like me, you're from an environment where the trauma was also compounded by gaslighting. So first, abuse happens, but then you're gaslit into thinking that actually abuse didn't happen, or that you're somehow making it up or extravagating it. And so that had happened to me a lot during my childhood and youth. And so when I was about 19, 20 years old, I actually started acknowledging what had been done to me. Talking about my trauma actually felt very liberating. And so that's what I did. For a long time, I went to essentially everybody who I could get my hands on, and I would tell them about my trauma, about how I was feeling, about some of the things that had been done to me, and I did so in therapy. And this was, I don't want to like talk too badly about myself because I only did, first of all, I did was what was liberating in that aspect, because I'd spent so many years convincing myself that what had been done to me had been okay, or it had been my fault, or essentially that I could not blame my parents. Um, so talking about that, the fact that they had done what they had done empowered me, right? But it also wasn't very productive, because especially in talk therapy, I would be rehashing and rehashing the details of my trauma story, but I wouldn't really nothing would be resolved. Like, it would be the same things over and over again. And so I was in talk therapy for 3.5 years, and the entire time, I will say, very little changed for me in terms of how I experienced my trauma in my daily life. And what really moved the needle for me was when I understood that trauma isn't actually what happens to you, but it's what happens inside your body as it happens. Or another way to say that is that trauma isn't psychological, but it's neurological. So it changes your nervous system. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because when I began to understand that trauma wasn't just in my head, as all my years in talk therapy had, as society and also all my years in talk therapy had convinced me, but that actually trauma lives in my body, and that therefore to heal my trauma, I need to heal my body. That's when change really began to happen for me. So today I want to talk a bit about the neurological impact of trauma, and then some of the how you can actually heal that neurological impact of trauma. Yeah, and I see someone has dropped in. If you have any questions, please let me know as I start with the neurological impact of trauma. So, as I mentioned, trauma isn't so much what happens to you, but it is what happens inside your body as it happens. And that's connected to your sympathetic nervous system. So, your sympathetic nervous system is a part of your autonomic nervous system. And it's the sympathetic nervous, so the autonomic nervous system is responsible for controlling your body's like the functions of your body that you do not consciously control, like the fact that you're breathing. You're not thinking about that, you just do it. That's your autonomic nervous system. And one division of the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system. And that's the system that is responsible for your fight or flight mode, which I'm sure you've heard about before. Your fight or flight response is the response that your body launches when it thinks that you're in danger. So we've heard about the fight or flight responses, but another type of response is actually to hide or to freeze. So actually it should be called the fight, flight, hide, freeze response. And sometimes it is nowadays referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze response. So fighting, hiding, freezing, or trying to flee are your body's pre-programmed ways of responding to danger. The interesting thing is that modern hunter-gatherer societies and animals don't experience trauma, or at least they don't experience as much trauma as we do, even though they objectively live much more difficult lives than most humans living in, not in hunter-gatherer societies. And that's because the dangers they encounter are very much the dangers our body evolved to process. So, I don't know, being attacked by an animal in the wild. And that means that something dangerous happens, their body launches their fight, flight, or freeze response, and most likely they escape the danger. And the interesting thing is that when your body successfully launches this fight, flight, or freeze response, you are not traumatized, because your body afterwards, the body will process the emotions that came up as part of that. So you will be crying, or for example, something animals do in the wild that you can see is that they shake their bodies. They're releasing like this pent up energy in their bodies, and then afterwards they go on with their life. And that's when the parasympathetic nervous system activates, which is another division of the autonomic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for regulating your rest and digest state. And I will talk about that more later. But what is traumatic is when your body launches this fight, flight, or freeze response, and it doesn't do so successfully. So, for example, if you're in a situation where it's impossible for you to escape, or it's impossible for you to hide, or freezing doesn't actually make the danger pass. So your body launches this pre-programmed response, but it's not successful. The danger continues. And what happens is, even after that specific danger has passed, your body keeps, or rather your brain keeps releasing stress hormones, because your body, since the response was unsuccessful, doesn't understand that the danger is actually over. And that means that you keep living life as if you were still in the same situation 20 years ago that originally traumatized you. And I want to read a quote. By the way, everything I'm talking about here, I didn't make it up, but I'm referring this book by psychiatrist Bessel Kolk, who is, leading expert on PTSD. And I wanted to read a quote. Where is it? Yeah. So this is about the effects of trauma on your system. After trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their lives. These attempts to maintain control over unbearable physiological reactions can result in a whole range of physical symptoms, including chronic fatigue and autoimmune disease. So that means that a traumatized mind lives in a traumatized body. And I hope you can see now how simply talking about trauma, while an important step, doesn't actually address where your trauma lives, namely in your body. Because as I said, your brain keeps thinking that you're in this dangerous situation, and it means that your body doesn't actually leave the sympathetic nerve, or that the sympathetic nervous system doesn't deactivate, and that your body keeps living in what I'll refer to as survival mode. And survival mode is really what it sounds like. When you're in survival mode, your body thinks that it's being chased by a wild animal. And that means that all bodily functions that are not important for immediate survival are, they are not prioritized. Remember how I mentioned that the parasympathetic nervous system is called the rest and digest state. So the job of the parasympathetic nervous system is actually to regulate the sympathetic nervous system, or rather, their job is to balance each other. But when you're in chronic sympathetic nervous system activation, that means that your functions such as digestion or resting are impaired. And this really affects all aspects of your life if you think about it. Because if you can't properly digest your food, you will have health issues. If you have health issues, they will compound into other health issues. If you can't rest, that means that you are in a chronic state of re-traumatization. And it obviously also impairs your relationships, because one of the side effects of chronic sympathetic nervous system activation is like a lack of emotional safety and a lack of the inability to enjoy intimacy. So this trauma, this physiological impact of trauma affects every aspect of your life. And as I mentioned, talking about your trauma doesn't actually address all of these effects. And I would say that for me, actually talking about my trauma so much kind of even worsened these physiological effects of trauma, because I remember being in therapy and talking about these traumatic events in my life, and that actually brought up a lot of sensations in my body. But because I simply talked about them, I didn't actually learn any tools to manage these sensations in my body. So I would continuously bring up these sensations, these emotions. I would bring them up to the surface, but I wouldn't actually process them. And I think that's very important to understand, that talking about trauma isn't actually processing trauma. Talking about trauma, it's acknowledging trauma, right? But it's not actually moving the needle on going from acknowledging to integrating. So that's one of the reasons that if you want to talk about your trauma, which of course is an important aspect of healing, you also need to be aware of the effects of trauma on your body. Let me take another look at my notes. Yeah, and I think there is like this belief that you can talk yourself out of trauma is kind of based on this body-mind dichotomy Western civilization has been running on ever since the Enlightenment period. But the truth is, like, first of all, that's like a cultural construct, and I won't even go into that. I'm a historian, so I could go into that, but I won't. But let me just say that there is no such thing as like an emotional and irrational mind, because as a human being, you are an emotional being. Your emotions are actually important for your survival, and therefore it's impossible to make any kind of decisions as a human being without actually accessing your emotions, because your emotions are your information you have to assess in order to make a proper judgment about the world around you, which is what the rational mind is supposed to do, right? So we assume that we can talk ourselves out of trauma, because we assume that we can just, like, our rational conscious will must be enough to deal with our past. And I think this is like a false belief for two reasons. The first I already mentioned, because there is no such thing as a truly rational mind, especially because trauma actually shuts off your conscious mind, which what you would call the rational mind, I'll call the conscious mind. And that's, again, connected to the sympathetic nervous system response, because, as I mentioned, in survival mode, every function that is not necessary for your survival in a dangerous situation is shut off. And your conscious mind is part of that. It's also connected to part of the reason is because the survival mode is housed in our lower brain, which is the most primal part of our brain, while the conscious mind is part of the higher parts of our brain, which are more recently evolved. But if you think about it, that's also a good thing, the fact that your survival mode shuts off your conscious mind. Because imagine you're driving on a highway and you see the car in front of you crash into another car. Do you really want to be sitting there and thinking and deliberating what would be the best course of action and thereby lose precious seconds? Or do you want your body to slam the brakes before you understand what's going on? So really, it's a good thing that that survival mode does not prioritize our conscious mind. But it also works against us in talk therapy, because like I had so many situations where I could be talking about something like, current situation in my life, and I could be talking about it so rationally with my therapist or with friends. I would be so above it all. But then when you're actually in the situation and something triggers your survival mode, like you cannot access all of that conscious thought. Like when you're really in it, and your survival mode kicks in, you're beyond conscious thought. And so that's one reason why talking about trauma isn't as effective as we are led to believe. And another reason is that the reason we're talking about trauma is, or we're talking about the traumatic events that occurred in our life, is kind of because we're trying to figure out why. Like, why do I have the response I have? And that can be very helpful. As I mentioned, I'm a historian, so I'm always asking why. Why is the world the way it is? But there's only a certain point until which you can know the why. And I believe that for the majority of the things that shape us, we actually cannot get to the why. And that's because I will never remember the first 3 years of my life. I will never remember all of the specific situations that occurred that led me to have the traumatized nervous system I have. And I will also never know all the situations that occurred in my parents' lives that caused them to have dysregulated nervous systems they thereby passed on to me, right? I can also never understand the trauma my grandmother experienced when my mother was in her womb, when my grandmother was pregnant with my mother, or even when my grandmother was born and already had the cell that would become my mother. It's like all of these are unknowable to me. I will never know them. I can be in therapy for 50 years. I will never know why all these things are the way they are. And that's not even talking about that's just talking about my recent ancestry. And we know that these all have impact on us because of epigenetics. But I can never, for example, I'm part of an ethnic group that in the country my grandparents were from were persecuted. So that means that I carry in my family this trauma of persecution. I will never know the trauma my grandparents experienced due to that. I can know it intellectually. I carry it with me in my body, but I can never know the whys. I can never know all the specific situations. So I think I've made this point very clear that in this search for why, we're essentially we're searching for something we're asking a question we can never truly answer. And I'd rather ask productive questions. Namely, okay, if the nervous system is dysregulated, and if that's the reason that I keep being re-traumatized, then what can we do to regulate the nervous system? And I will take a sip of water now. So, nervous system regulation. There are essentially two ways to regulate the nervous system, or rather, there are two avenues you can take to regulate the nervous system. And one is top-down regulation, which means that you're, and I'm looking at my notes, which means that you're strengthening your ability to monitor your body's sensations. That's a quote by Bessel van der Kolk. So I would translate this as using your conscious mind to learn to regulate your body. And here, a very good tool is mindfulness. I talked about that in another video, how mindfulness was one of the tools that really changed my life. And mindfulness, I would define as the ability to become conscious in the present moment. Because essentially what the survival mode does is it shuts off your ability to be conscious of the present moment, right? And so top-down regulation is one avenue, and mindfulness is just one of many ways to do that. And then you have bottom-up nervous system regulation. And bottom-up nervous system regulation works with learning to control your body's stress response. And so that means with bottom-up regulation, you're not working with the conscious mind, but you're working with your body. So that involves conscious breathing, it involves movement, it involves touch. And here, for example, breath work can be something that's really, really helpful. And so top-down regulation, I would say that's something you do when you're, kind of not when you're in the middle of a confrontation, for example, but that some top-down regulation practices are something you can really integrate into your life to build your nervous system's capacity of dealing with your body's sensation. Well, bottom-up regulation are things you can also do these throughout your day, but bottom-up regulation methods are something that you will really benefit from in situations where you are actually let's call it activated, because I don't like the word triggered. And again, these involve conscious breathing techniques. These involve, for example, scanning the room. So if you're like, you notice that you're really getting stressed in a situation, for example, an argument with your partner, you can first of all, you can tell them, right? You can be honest. You can say, hey, this is bringing up a lot for me. I need a moment. And if they're a good partner, then and you've maybe discussed this with them beforehand, then hopefully they will understand. And then you can take a moment to breathe. You can do the 4-count breathing method that that we did in another video, which means that you're breathing in, holding, breathing out, holding for 4 seconds each, and you do that for, I don't know, a minute, and you should already feel better. Or especially, actually, if you're activated, I would suggest elongating the outer breath, because when you're breathing out, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So as I said, you can do these bottom-up practices actually when you're in a stressful situation, and that will help by bringing the parasympathetic nervous system back online. You're actually also bringing your conscious mind back online. And so I hope you can see how both in the short term and in the long term, nervous system regulation is actually key for trauma healing. And that's not to discredit. And again, that's not to discredit actually talking about your trauma. It is an important step. But talking about what happened, why it happened, that's kind of like archaeology. And what you're really doing when you're healing your trauma is you're not just discovering what happened, but you're also trying to build something new. You're trying to build a healthier life, a life that you can live to the fullest, that you can enjoy. And that's not archaeology, but that's architecture. And I really hope that you consider nervous system regulation as an important part of that architecture process. Please let me know if this was helpful or if it wasn't, because what I introduced today are key aspects of the book I'm writing on childhood trauma healing. And so this was essentially an overview of the first chapter. So I'd really be interested in what questions you have, what you'd like me to elaborate on, whether this was helpful at all or not. And you can actually already pre-order my book. It's in a very early stage, but I have, because some people wanted to pre-order, I opened the pre-order and I've linked that in the description box below. I also have put the information on the book in the description box, because this is really one of the classics of trauma healing, somatic trauma healing, which means trauma healing that works with the body. And I recommend it if you're interested in the details of what I discussed today. And I also do these live streams every Wednesday. So if you have any questions, if you have any topics you'd like me to cover, then please leave them in the comment section below, or you can always join me live. So yeah, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a good day and see you soon.